Hey, folks, I'm back. So, this lecture is about where the concept of race came from, like the historical roots of this concept, the way that we have it today. So, we need to unpack a little bit about, well, I guess in a previous lecture when we talked about the biology of human variation and how race is not a biologically valid way of dividing human variation because the data just doesn't support that. Before we talked about that, we mentioned, what are we talking about when we talk about race? And some of it was that there are a number that you can clearly define of discrete groups of people that are more similar to one another biologically than the other groups, and that there's some sort of like broad grouping, because of course you could say, well, your family's more closely related than than your cousin's family or something, or you and another person from the same part of your country, from the same region or the same village, are more closely related than you and someone from a far-flung village somewhere, or so I mean, you could try and break all that down, and and depending on how you want to draw the circles and stuff like that, you can create true statements like, obviously, like if you're in a smaller area and people have been mixing it up in that area, they're going to be more similar genetically than people from far away. But the idea of like four, five, however, many groups, so like a handful of groups you want to make on a broad global level, are distinct biologically from one another, and that it's easy to draw those boundaries, and that people within those groups are all more closely related to each other than any of them are to someone in another group, that's wrong. And also, the idea, along with colonialism and racist ideology, the idea developed that personality and IQ and potential and violence and all these things are somehow rooted in this concept of race as well, right? So that's a very specific historical construction. So, to say that race doesn't exist biologically is not the same thing as saying there aren't biological differences between people. Of course there are. There's biological differences between you and your parents, you and your siblings. There's biological differences that you can see between someone from Finland and someone from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? So we're not saying human biological variation doesn't exist. We're saying that these broad level, discrete groupings of people, and everything that's attached to that is not factually correct. So where did the idea of these groups come from? That's what we're talking about. We're not trying to say where did the idea that people are different come from, because of course people are different. We're talking about this specific historical construct that we have in our brains in our society today. And of course, that's been changing. It's been changing recently, but we're all familiar with it, right? We have conversations about this all the time and the repercussions of that thinking. So where did it come from? Well, one way of tackling this, rather than to look at simply the history of describing races of people of color, you can sort of flip it around and look at the concept of white people as a group. And so there's a book, I should have had it here so I could show you. There's a book by a professor named Nell Irvin Painter called The History of White People. And if we were in class, this would probably be funnier because of the way I would tell it. But I bought this book and was reading it while I was doing dissertation research abroad in Poland, and I would be carrying it with me, if I was on a train or something. But I would hide it. I would hide it so that no one could read what it said, because, if you just read the history of white people, it sounds like some kind of crazy white supremacist extremist thing, but actually it's not. Nell Irvin Painter is actually a black woman, and she's distinguished. She has a distinguished academic career. Edwards Professor of American History Emerita at Princeton University. Emerita means essentially she's retired, but it's an honorary. Not everyone gets emerita or emeritus. She got her bachelor's in anthropology from Berkeley, her master's in African history from UCLA, and her PhD in American history from Harvard. So, she's writing from obviously the perspective of a historian, someone with an anthropological background, someone who knows something about African history, a black woman herself in America, and a woman who has a white partner. So she has a unique perspective that probably came into this question of, where did this idea come from? So she goes through the history of it. So she talks a bit first about like antiquity. If we're going back to like classical times, was there race in antiquity? Well, there were historians or pseudo-historians and geographers and people writing in the classical world that talked about other peoples. But in the so-called Western canon, these were usually originally like Greeks or people living within the Greek world, like Herodotus, that second name that you see there, writing about people outside of the Greek world. So some of whom they were more familiar with than others. And the most important distinction was, are you Greek or are you not Greek? And in describing these people, of course, they would describe their culture and their practices and things like this, but they would describe physical features. They would notice whether they were lighter skinned or darker skinned, or what hair color they had, or what their stature was, or something like this compared to the Greeks. But they did not divide up the world into white people and people of color, or a European race and an African race and these types of things. To the Greeks, the other so-called barbarian peoples of Europe were wildly different in a lot of ways. So the Scythians. So this picture is an artist's rendition of some female Scythian warriors who may have been the inspiration for the Amazons of antiquity. But the Scythians seemed like a very strange people to the Greeks. The Celts were something different. So they recognize biological variation, they recognize cultural variation, but they don't ascribe it to any kind of category like race. They say that culture and temperament are not influenced by some kind of racial roots or biology. They felt like it was influenced by climate. People in warmer climates tended to be a little bit more lazy, a little bit more open. People where the weather shifts drastically from one season to another are more excitable and unpredictable, and not organized in their thinking. So that's how the Greeks saw it in antiquity. But I want to jump to the chapters that I assigned you, which I believe were chapters 5 and 6 in her book, which I posted. I posted those chapters on Canvas. And this is going to seem like a parade of names of old dead white guys, and it kind of is. But it puts the evolution of this idea into a historical context and a political context and a philosophical context and an economic context. And so throughout when I'm talking about these people, I created this timeline, and it shows you when these individuals lived and also what was going on at the time, at least in Europe, and how things like the slave trade, which obviously affected much more than Europe, were tied in with this. So just real quick, you see in the background, I have like the Enlightenment period in that sort of blue, and the Romantic period in that sort of pink. And obviously these are concepts that were created retroactively by historians to look at common threads of thought in those times, but they do encapsulate a certain spirit of thinking. So the Enlightenment, was when science started to compete as an epistemology with religion, and to overtake it in its clout as an epistemology, as a way of seeking truth in some aspects. Obviously, there still were lots of people that were quite religious, and there still are, but the degree to which the church controlled the thinking before the Enlightenment was much different than the situation we have today. And the Enlightenment is when that started to change. When, laws and policies, say, started to be based on science and data and analysis, and not necessarily on scripture or just on the whims of a monarch. It didn't change overnight. These are broad periods, and there's no discrete boundaries. But also in the Enlightenment, people were very into classifying and categorizing things. So we'll get to that in a little while. In the Romantic period, people started to react a little bit against the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment had worshipped classical antiquity. Enlightenment thinkers in Europe tended to look back to the Romans and Greeks as the epitome of civilization and art and anything you can think of, and they started claiming those as their intellectual ancestors. In the Romantic period, there was a shift towards nationalistic movements, uniting German-speaking peoples and reclaiming some kind of a history there. Not only in Germany, in France and pretty much everywhere, but they started to look more inward for their roots, and science was still kind of like a big thing, but it wasn't. I guess it was still categorical, but it took on a different flavor, and maybe a more nationalistic flavor. And also, you see on the timeline itself, we have the first major stage of French colonialism was going on, before and during the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution starts in the 1760s to 1780s. And is really in full force, by the close to the mid 1800s. And the peak of the transatlantic slave trade was occurring in the decades prior to 1800. That was the absolute peak. So, just to put this in context, the first person that she talks about is Winkelmann. I will refer to him as Winkelmann. Joachim Winkelmann. And now, there's a lot of Johanns in this lecture. So he was from what's now Germany. It was broken up into different polities, and I'm not familiar enough with how those changed during this time. But he was from what's now Germany, and he was considered the father of art history. He wrote a big tome about classical art, so the history of the art of antiquity, and he studied classical art in Italy. He was really into Greek sculpture, but at the time Greece was under control of the Ottoman Empire, and it was kind of difficult for just a random European to go there. So he settled for going to Italy. And interestingly, I think she talks about how he actually converted to Catholicism so that he could study there. But anyway, so he was studying Roman copies of Greek sculptures. And of course, he thought he just worshipped the Greeks and thought they were the greatest. And he noted these fine white marble sculptures with no color on them anywhere, and he thought that that was intentional, that that was somehow connected to their idea of beauty. And this picture here is Apollo Belvedere, which who I guess was a Greek god, and he thought that this face was the most perfect face possible. Like, this is the epitome of aesthetics. Now, what he didn't realize was that the original Greek sculptures were not white, and they were not made on the same kind of marble that was used in Italy. So, in fact, they were painted, these Greek originals, but he didn't know that because he couldn't go there and see them. And also, over the years, some of that's worn off, and art historians have been able to analyze them and figure out more of what colors were actually used. So they probably had darker skin, but he got this idea that Greek art is the most beautiful, and the Greeks recognized that this pure white color was beautiful. So he really influenced aesthetics and also this reverence towards the classical world. And he influenced a lot of people, including Goethe, which I don't even know a good way to say it that doesn't make me sound like someone who can't speak German. But he is a very famous, now deceased, of course, German intellectual and diplomat and writer, playwright. He's also from what's now Germany. And even though his life overlapped with periods of the Enlightenment, he was really known in the Romantic period for kind of turning to German folklore. He was very influenced by Winkelmann and his love of Greek art. And Goethe was more well-known even throughout history. Sorry if you hear a dog barking out there. And so he himself influenced a lot of people, and he began to sort of meld these Greek influences with German folklore. And so his peers, his other German intellectuals, started to claim the Greek bodies and Greek culture as their true ancestors in the Romantic period, kind of, again, sort of worshiping, elevating that, and claiming that as their roots. So this idea of some kind of pan-Western, pan-European identity and superiority was kind of coming into place. Then we have another Johann, I believe, Camper, who lived between 1722 and 1789, so overlapping periods of both Winkelmann and Goethe. And he was from the Netherlands. Oh, sorry, he's a Petrus, not a Johann. He was from the Netherlands. He was both an illustrator and artist and an anatomist, and he tried to use his knowledge of anatomy to inform his artwork. So he studied faces and skulls in order to look at ratios, presumably to help in his illustrations. And, this is also during the time when there's a lot more interaction between Europeans and Africans and Asians and, indigenous Americans. And so, people were much more familiar with a diversity of phenotypical characteristics in the world. And so there were these typologies. The typology is where you take like one representative of an entire group, a group that you define, and you say this is the quintessential representative of that group. So it sort of makes it real. It makes that group seem like it is homogeneous. So he took skulls here. He has a skull of either an orangutan or a chimpanzee. He has the skull of, I believe it was a Kalmuk, which was some ethnic group of maybe Central Asia. He has a representative, and I might be getting some of these confused. A representative of an African, a representative of a European, and a representative of Apollo Belvedere. So the highest form of beauty, the best ratios in the face, according to him and Winkelmann. And he created this measure called the facial angle, which was supposed to measure prognathism, which is how much your kind of mid face or lower face comes out from the rest of your skull, which I suppose is probably this angle here somehow. And so he characterized these skulls by their facial angle. And he showed that, of course, well, look, the European is right next to the Greek god. The African is next to the European, the Kalmuk is next to the African, and then the chimpanzee is next to the Kalmuk. But he said that this demonstrates the near parity of mankind, that mankind is all closer to one another than any of us are to a Greek god or to a chimpanzee. So although the facial angles here are different, he says they're closer to one another than, say, the European is to the Greek god or the Kalmuk is to the chimpanzee. So in his mind, this was actually, saying, look, people are pretty equal. But of course, that's not how it was used. If you just look at this representation, you say, oh, look, Europeans are clearly at the top of this pyramid, and others are closer to the animal kingdom. So again, what's going on during this time is the slave trade, and there's obviously a conflict, sort of a cognitive dissonance between the Christianity of Europe at the time and then treating people like property, worse than animals. And so how do you justify that in your mind in a way that seems consistent? Well, some people took the path that, well, there are lesser forms of humankind, and we higher forms have a duty to do what we will with the rest of humanity. So now we have another Johann, for sure. There's another Johann Liebl from Switzerland. And he's known as the father of physiognomy. Now, physiognomy is the science, it's pseudoscience, it's not real science, of assessing a person's character from their outward appearance. So he took these kind of classical ideas of phlegmatic and choleric and sanguine and melancholic as temperament types, and saying, you can tell just by looking at someone, looking at their face, which type of temperament they have. So, here he created some representative sample here. This is the phlegmatic kind of like, whatever person. This is the kind of easily excitable, kind of angry, choleric. This is the sanguine, happy-go-lucky, maybe kind of naive person. And this is the melancholic, sort of sad, pessimistic person here. And this was eventually, of course, discredited by more serious scholars, but this idea that you could tell someone about the character of a person by looking at them, that your biology and your personality and maybe even by extension culture are connected, that starts to come together as an idea in this time. And of course, that would later be used, or maybe even at the time, by so-called scientific racists, people who would use this new scientific epistemology to try and justify, the subjugation of some people So then we have Dr. John Hunter, who was a Scotsman, who was influenced by Petrus Camper and his facial angle, and he did some similar work. And he typologized human skulls, and I have "the" in italics because, again, a typology is saying this is a relatively homogeneous group, and you have a representative that is like, this is your archetype of a European, the Asian, the American, the African, as if everybody is the same in those groups. Charles White was from England. Again, he was looking at facial angle and prognathism and various things, and he did this really kind of crazy elaborate thing where he goes from some kind of a bird to a crocodile to a greyhound, even classifying dogs by their level of prognathism to chimpanzees, and then of course to mankind, where again, look what you see here is I think this might be a European, or this might be an Englishman, and this is a Greek person or something, and this is Apollo Belvedere, and of course everyone below that is of a different group, a different type. Now, at the time, there were some competing thoughts about the origin of mankind. There was monogenesis, which is, that there was one act of creation that people came out of, and there was polygenesis, which is the separate acts of creation of different species or types of mankind. So again, this is used to try to relieve that cognitive dissonance. Like, if we're all brothers in Christ, how can we treat some people way differently and way worse? God created man in his image, but really he created them separately, and maybe it was a little different for some others. So again, pretty influential among 19th century racist and American anthropology. This is really before there was a discipline of anthropology, but people who would study things like this. Okay, then there was Johann Blumenbach. And Johann Blumenbach is an important one to know. I'm not going to ask you about all of these people. I'll put on the study guide which ones, but definitely Blumenbach, Petrus Camper, and there's another one coming up, Christoph Meiners. But anyway, Blumenbach was also from what's now Germany. Did a doctoral dissertation on the natural variety of mankind, and he actually created new ways of measuring the skull, some of which we use today for various purposes, actually, just for because they're standardized, so it's a better way to look at the overall morphology of skulls if you want to compare them in some way. So he also tried to typologize or classify human variation into a handful of groups. But a couple of things that he did that were different from others is he added skin color to his definition of what he called human varieties. So as Nell Irvin Painter says, and I'm gonna post a video of her, he was writing in Latin, and the translation from the Latin was essentially races. So this was really the first time, or shortly thereafter, that race starts getting used as a term to describe these typologies. Now, he had different numbers of categories over his career, sometimes 4. Then he got another skull, and it was 5. But his colleague, who we'll talk about in a little bit, Christoph Meiners, said there were only 2. And Blumenbach was like, well, we can't really say exactly how many. You can kind of choose what you think. But a sort of funny / tragic story is that he had 4 varieties, and then he knew a wealthy person that was funding some kind of expedition to somewhere in the South Pacific, I think, or like Melanesia. And he said, oh, Sir, you're so wonderful, and thank you for being a patron of my work and of the arts, and blah, blah, blah. Could you please have them bring me back a skull? And this guy says, well, people generally aren't too excited about parting with their skulls, so I'm not really sure that I can do that. And he's like, oh, please, I'll mention you in my next work and all this stuff. So the guy somehow buys a skull off of somebody, and then all of a sudden he has his new skull, and he creates a category for that skull. It's the only one he's ever seen from that region, but he decides it deserves its own category. So this wasn't really done very scientifically. The other thing he's known for is he is the reason why white people, quote unquote, are called Caucasian, even today on formal documents and sometimes on censuses and things like that. There's a long history about why. Essentially, there were some early travelers' reports from wealthy merchants who traveled throughout the old world, and one influential one talked about how beautiful people were in the Caucasus region, in Georgia specifically, I think. And if you look at a map, the Caucasus are technically in Asia, you know, above what's now like Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and not far from Turkey and Iran. So, but anyway, they were known as being supremely beautiful, and the skull that he used to represent the Caucasian variety was from a Georgian sex slave, actually, that had been captured by the Russians and apparently died of syphilis, which is tragic. But her skull to him was the most beautiful variety, even though he recognized that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And of course, people of different cultures think people in their own culture are the most beautiful, but from his Eurocentric perspective, this skull supposedly representing Europeans, but from Western Asia, was the most beautiful. So he created this variety called the Caucasian variety, and he describes it in terms of the skull, but also in terms of the skin color. So he brings in, sort of whiteness into this. And so that's where the term Caucasian comes from. It's a giant historical misnomer. Then there was a guy, Sir William Jones. Now, he was different because he was a linguist. He was a Welsh linguist, and he's the one that came up with the idea that there was an Indo-European language family, and that's still held to be true today. He noticed similarities between ancient Sanskrit and ancient Greek, and also some of the living European languages. And so, he came up with this idea that they're all somehow related, the languages. But then, of course, eventually this seeped into this developing racial ideology, and the idea of like some kind of Indo-European stock as a massive race of people. It started to spread so that even today, sometimes on certain forms, if you mark Caucasian, it'll specify any of the original peoples of Europe or North Africa or Western Asia or the Indian subcontinent. So it has grown because of all this random historical stuff that was coming together, and these ideas of wanting to create types of people. Then you have Christoph Meiners. Christoph Meiners was, as I said before, a colleague of Blumenbach, and he was also from what's now Germany. He worked at the same university as Blumenbach. He's not remembered as well or as fondly. His work was less rigorous than Blumenbach. And he, unlike Blumenbach and unlike Camper, was outwardly what we would now call racist in his ideas. He was outwardly prejudiced and made no bones about it. And he said, according to Nell Irvin Painter, quote, Miner made no bones about it. Inferior people's inferiority justified, even required, their enslavement and the use of despotism for their control. So he felt that, inequality was justified because there was a hierarchy, and some people were just inferior. Now, he also became a hero of the Nazis, even though he's writing over a century before the Nazis were even a thing. They looked back and they were influenced by his writings and his philosophies. And again, this is in more the Romantic period where nationalism was growing, and he said that the ancient Germans' beauty rivaled even the ancient Greeks and their athletic prowess and fitness. And he quoted this ancient Roman historian who is not necessarily known for being impartial or always historically accurate, Tacitus, who talked about the supposed purity of the bloodline of the ancient Germans, that they just didn't mix with other peoples, which is patently absurd. So obviously they were at the top of his hierarchy, but he really broke humanity down into two races: basically the beautiful race and the ugly race. And within the beautiful race, there were a couple of different types that were sort of in a bit of a hierarchy. I'm going to post this video of Nell Irvin Painter. I won't make you watch it within my lecture, but where she talks about some of this. So you don't need to watch the whole thing. I'll put on there like watch until something. But the main thing to take away here is that what we think of as race today has historical roots in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the 17 and 1800s, really. And although people recognized biological variation, they recognized cultural variation prior to that, they didn't ascribe it to the same causes, and they didn't make it sound so immutable, so unable to change. Whereas when this concept of race sort of evolved to what it became by the early 20th century, it was the idea of groups of people that could be easily categorized, where you could say, oh, that's a person of this race, they must be like this or this or this, or they can't do that, or they're particularly good at this, or they're violent, or what have you. And the idea of sort of like ranking races also. So that all came together during this time, and it was a bunch of different strands of philosophy and pseudoscience and some science, misused, of course, that came together to weave this fabric. It didn't develop overnight, but over the course of these 2 centuries, it became something that we're familiar with today. And it's left a lasting legacy because people then used this pseudoscience to justify different treatments of people throughout that period and into the 20th century. And obviously we're still dealing with the fallout and the repercussions of that today. So anyway, that's kind of a quick overview, and that's developing during this time we're talking about, when capitalism was taking on a more modern form, when slavery as we know it was at its peak, leading up to the time of the Civil War and, abolition, and then the Reconstruction era, and then into the early 20th century when, people that were not white could not become full citizens of the United States for a while. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I'll post this video of Nell Irvin Painter talking about her book, and I'll see you for the next lecture pretty soon. Okay, take care.